Lady Lee walked into the Pentagon's most classified briefing room at 0800 hours sharp, four-star generals rising from their chairs as she entered. Just 18 months earlier, these same men had demoted her to mopping floors and emptying trash cans, convinced that a 5 feet 4 inches European-born analyst had no place in America's defense leadership. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow, I've saved something extra special for you. They were about to discover just how catastrophically wrong they'd been. The fluorescent lights hummed overhead as Lady Lee adjusted her oversized military blazer for the third time that morning. At 26, she stood barely 5 feet 4 in her regulation heels, her slight frame dwarfed by the imposing corridors of the Pentagon. Born in Prague and raised in Vienna before immigrating to the United States at 15, Lady Lee carried herself with the quiet intensity of someone who'd learned to navigate multiple worlds but never quite belonged to any of them. The morning sun streamed through the Pentagon's reinforced windows as Lady Lee made her way to the Defense Intelligence briefing room. Her workspace was a modest cubicle in Section C4, surrounded by towering stacks of classified reports and satellite imagery that she analyzed with methodical precision. While her colleagues discussed weekend plans and office politics, Lady Lee immersed herself in patterns, troop movements, supply chain logistics, communication intercepts, seeing connections that others missed. "Chun's here early again," muttered Lieutenant Colonel Brooks to his coffee-drinking companion. "That girl never stops working. It's almost unnatural." Lady Lee pretended not to hear, but the words stung with familiar precision. Her European accent, though faint after 11 years in America, still marked her as an outsider. Her intensity in studying intelligence reports was viewed as obsessive rather than thorough. Her ability to speak 4 languages fluently was seen as showing off rather than valuable. The Defense Intelligence Agency had recruited Lady Lee straight from Georgetown University, where she'd graduated summa cum laude with dual degrees in international relations and computer science. Her thesis on predictive modeling in asymmetric warfare had caught the attention of Pentagon recruiters who promised that her unique perspective would be valued in America's intelligence community. That was 2 years ago. Since then, she'd watched as her male colleagues received promotions, high-profile assignments, and access to decision-makers, while she remained relegated to data analysis and report generation. Lady Lee's supervisor, Colonel Marcus Webb, was a 48-year-old career officer who'd built his reputation on traditional military thinking and conventional wisdom. He treated Lady Lee with the polite condescension reserved for junior personnel who were technically competent, but lacked the intangible qualities necessary for real leadership. "Chun does good work," he'd tell visiting officials, "very detail-oriented. Perfect for the analytical side of things." The analytical side of things. Lady Lee had heard that phrase dozens of times, always delivered with a tone that suggested analysis was somehow less important than the real work of military strategy and operational planning. Never mind that her analyzers had identified 3 potential security threats that others had missed. Never mind that her economic modeling had predicted the collapse of 2 allied governments 6 months before it happened. She was European, female, small in stature, and therefore relegated to the background while others took credit for implementing insights derived from her work. During meetings, Lady Lee would raise her hand to contribute ideas based on her analysis, only to watch as her suggestions were politely acknowledged and then promptly ignored. When the same ideas were presented by her male colleagues weeks later, they were hailed as innovative thinking. The frustration built like pressure in a sealed container, but Lady Lee had learned to channel it into longer hours and more meticulous preparation. Her colleagues saw her staying late as evidence of inefficiency rather than dedication. They interpreted her detailed reports as overthinking rather than thoroughness. When she volunteered for additional training in strategic planning and crisis management, It was viewed as academic curiosity rather than professional ambition. Lady Lee was trapped in a narrative that cast her as a competent but limited analyst whose foreign background and quiet demeanor disqualified her from serious consideration for leadership roles. The irony wasn't lost on her that an institution dedicated to defending American democracy seemed unwilling to embrace the diverse perspectives that made democracy strong. But Lady Lee had survived the transition from European teenager to American citizen, had navigated cultural barriers and language challenges that would have defeated others. She would find a way to prove that intelligence and determination mattered more than fitting conventional expectations of what a military leader should look like. The weekly operational briefings took place in Conference Room Alpha 7, a windowless space dominated by a massive display screen and a polished mahogany table that seated 20. Lady Lee had attended these meetings for 18 months, sitting in the same chair near the back, taking notes that were never requested and offering insights that were rarely acknowledged. The morning sun outside felt like a distant memory in this artificially lit chamber, where careers were made and broken. Colonel Webb presided over these gatherings with the confidence of someone who'd never questioned his place in the hierarchy. Around the table sat the Pentagon's rising stars, Major David Harrison, whose Harvard MBA and family military connections had fast-tracked him to strategic planning. Captain Michael Torres, whose aggressive operational proposals had earned him a reputation as a decisive leader. Lieutenant Colonel Jennifer Parks, whose media-friendly presentations had made her the unofficial spokesperson for innovative military thinking. Today's agenda focuses on emerging threats in Eastern Europe, Webb announced, his voice carrying the authority that came with 2 decades of service. Harrison, brief us on the economic intelligence indicators. Lady Lee's heart sank as she watched Harrison present analysis that was fundamentally identical to a report she'd submitted 3 weeks earlier. Her detailed examination of currency fluctuations and trade pattern disruptions had somehow become Harrison's preliminary assessment of regional stability factors. The presentation continued with Torres discussing operational readiness assessments that borrowed heavily from Lady Lee's infrastructure vulnerability analysis. When Parks outlined communication intercept patterns, Lady Lee recognized her own linguistic analysis repackaged as innovative signal intelligence interpretation. Her work was being systematically appropriated, her insights filtered through the voices of people deemed more suitable for strategic leadership. Questions or comments? Webb asked as the presentations concluded. Lady Lee raised her hand tentatively. Sir, regarding the Eastern European analysis, I think we should consider the historical precedents from the 1990s economic transitions. The current pattern suggests, Chun, Webb interrupted with practiced patience. I appreciate your attention to historical detail, but we need to focus on actionable intelligence rather than academic analysis. Harrison, can you elaborate on the operational implications? The dismissal was swift and surgical. Lady Lee's European perspective, which should have been invaluable when analyzing European threats, was reduced to academic analysis, while Harrison's recycled observations were elevated to operational implications. Around the table, she caught sympathetic glances from junior staff who'd witnessed similar dismissals, but sympathy didn't translate to support when careers were at stake. The pattern repeated itself across every major assignment. When tensions escalated in the South China Sea, Lady Lee's comprehensive analysis of Chinese military modernization was credited to Torres's strategic assessment team. When cyber threats emerged from state-sponsored hacking groups, her identification of attack vectors became Parks's innovative cybersecurity framework. Lady Lee's name appeared in footnotes and acknowledgments, relegated to the supporting cast while others claimed the spotlight. The exclusion extended beyond formal meetings into the informal networks where real decisions were made. Golf outings at the Army-Navy Country Club didn't include junior analysts, especially those who didn't fit the traditional mold. Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now back to the story. Happy hour gatherings at the Officers Club somehow never extended invitations to foreign-born staff members. The mentorship opportunities that accelerated careers were reserved for people who reminded senior leaders of their younger selves. Lady Lee began to understand that competence was necessary but insufficient for advancement. The Pentagon, like many large institutions, operated on unspoken rules about who belonged in leadership positions. Her accent marked her as perpetually foreign despite her citizenship. Her size suggested weakness despite her intellectual strength. Her methodical approach was interpreted as lacking the aggressive confidence that characterized successful military leaders. The most painful exclusions were the ones that came wrapped in apparent inclusion. "Chun, we'd love your perspective on this," Webb would say before assigning her to research tasks that kept her buried in data while others developed policy. "Your analytical skills are invaluable," Parks would mention while ensuring that Lady Lee's role remained purely supportive. The message was clear. She was valuable enough to exploit, but not valuable enough to promote. Late one evening, as Lady Lee worked alone in the dimly lit analytical section, she overheard a conversation between Harrison and Torres in the adjacent corridor. "Webb's smart to keep Chun on the analytical side," Harrison was saying. "She's got a good eye for detail, but you need someone with presence for the strategic roles." "Someone who looks the part." "Agreed," Torres replied. "Nothing against her personally, but leadership requires a certain commanding presence. You can't train that." Their footsteps faded down the hallway, leaving Lady Lee alone with the bitter understanding that her exclusion wasn't based on performance deficiencies or skill gaps. It was based on perceptions about what leadership looked like, perceptions that no amount of competence could overcome. That night, Lady Lee made a decision that would change everything. If the system wouldn't recognize her capabilities through conventional channels, she would find another way to prove her worth. She began developing skills and knowledge that went far beyond her assigned duties, preparing for opportunities that might never come but could change everything if they did. Lady Lee's real education began at 4:30 a.m., 2 hours before her official workday started. While the Pentagon's corridors remained largely empty except for security personnel, she accessed training modules and classified databases that most analysts never bothered to explore. Her security clearance granted access to strategic planning courses, crisis management simulations, and operational doctrine that she studied with the intensity of someone preparing for an exam that might never come. The morning sun was just beginning to filter through the Pentagon's windows as Lady Lee completed her third consecutive week of advanced wargame simulations. These weren't the simplified exercises assigned to junior analysts, but the complex multi-theater scenarios used to train senior commanders. She ran through contingencies involving simultaneous conflicts in Eastern Europe, the Pacific, and the Middle East, learning to balance resource allocation, diplomatic considerations, and operational constraints in real-time decision-making. Her linguistic abilities, dismissed by her colleagues as mere academic curiosity, became powerful tools for understanding enemy communications and allied coordination. Lady Lee didn't just speak Czech, German, Russian, and Mandarin. She understood the cultural context that shaped military thinking in these regions. While her peers relied on translated intelligence summaries, Lady Lee accessed primary sources, identifying nuances and implications that were lost in translation. The Pentagon's vast digital library became her private university. Lady Lee studied the personal leadership styles of every major military commander from the past 50 years, analyzing their decision-making patterns during crisis situations. She memorized organizational charts for every branch of the military, understanding not just the formal hierarchy, but the informal networks that determined how information flowed and decisions were implemented. Her technical background proved Invaluable as warfare increasingly relied on sophisticated technology and data analysis. Lady Lee taught herself advanced cybersecurity protocols, satellite communication systems, and drone operational procedures. She understood that modern military leadership required fluency in both traditional strategic thinking and cutting-edge technological capabilities. Most importantly, Lady Lee developed what she called scenario planning, comprehensive analyses of potential crisis situations, and detailed response frameworks. Working late into the night, she created contingency plans for dozens of possible emergencies, terrorist attacks on critical infrastructure, cyber warfare campaigns against government systems, supply chain disruptions that could cripple military readiness. Each plan included resource requirements, timeline projections, and coordination protocols that would be necessary for effective response. Nobody knew about these preparations. Lady Lee's official duties required 8 hours of routine intelligence analysis, but she was investing 12 to 14 hours daily in developing capabilities that no one had asked her to develop. Her apartment became a second office, filled with strategic planning documents, leadership theory books, and technical manuals that she studied with religious devotion. The irony wasn't lost on her that she was preparing for responsibilities that the Pentagon seemed determined never to give her. But Lady Lee had learned from her European childhood that preparation created opportunities rather than the reverse. Her family had survived economic upheaval and political instability by anticipating changes before they occurred and developing capabilities before they were needed. Lady Lee's secret preparation extended beyond individual skill development to understanding the Pentagon's internal dynamics. She mapped the informal power structures that determined policy implementation, identified the key decision-makers whose opinions carried disproportionate weight, and studied the communication patterns that indicated when crises were developing. Before they became public knowledge, her analytical mind, so often dismissed as overly academic, proved perfect for this type of comprehensive preparation. Lady Lee created detailed profiles of every senior leader in the building, understanding their strengths, weaknesses, decision-making styles, and personal relationships. This wasn't office gossip, it was strategic intelligence that would be crucial for anyone who wanted to lead effectively in a complex bureaucratic environment. 6 months into her secret preparation regimen, Lady Lee had developed capabilities that exceeded those of many senior officers. She could coordinate multi-theater operations, manage complex logistics chains, navigate international diplomatic protocols, and make strategic decisions under extreme pressure. She'd become qualified for responsibilities that were still years away according to traditional career progression. But she'd learned that waiting for permission was a luxury that someone in her position couldn't afford. The most valuable skill Lady Lee developed was the ability to see the Pentagon not as an immutable hierarchy, but as a complex system that could be understood, navigated, and eventually influenced by someone with sufficient preparation and determination. She was no longer just a junior analyst hoping for recognition. She was a strategist preparing to seize opportunities that others wouldn't even recognize when they appeared. The first whispers began during a routine coffee break in the Pentagon's East Corridor Cafe. Lady Lee had been quietly eating lunch alone, as had become her habit, when she overheard Lieutenant Colonel Parks speaking in hushed tones to Major Harrison about unusual database access patterns that the security office had flagged during routine monitoring. Someone's been accessing strategic planning modules and classified operational scenarios well outside their clearance level, Parks was saying, her voice carrying the conspiratorial tone reserved for potential security breaches. The timestamps show access during off hours, which is always a red flag. Could be someone gathering intelligence for unauthorized purposes. Lady Lee's fork paused halfway to her mouth as she realized they were discussing her early morning study sessions. Her heart rate accelerated, but she forced herself to continue eating normally while listening to their conversation. The irony was bitter. Her dedication to understanding strategic planning was being framed as potentially subversive activity. Any idea who it might be? Harrison asked, his voice dropping to match Parks's conspiratorial whisper. Someone with foreign connections, maybe. You know how paranoid security gets about people with divided loyalties. The implication hung in the air like smoke. Lady Lee's European background, once merely a minor disadvantage in terms of cultural fit, was now being positioned as a potential security concern. Her accent, her immigrant history, her family connections to Prague suddenly transformed from biographical details into suspicious indicators. Over the following weeks, Lady Lee noticed subtle changes in how colleagues interacted with her. Conversations stopped when she approached groups in the hallway. Her security badge was checked more frequently at checkpoint stations. Her computer access was monitored more closely, with password changes required more often than standard protocol demanded. The mounting tension reached a crescendo during a department-wide briefing about information security protocols. Colonel Webb stood at the front of the conference room, his expression more serious than usual as he addressed the assembled staff. We've had reports of unauthorized access to classified materials and training modules, he announced. Everyone in this room has appropriate clearance levels, but accessing materials outside your assigned duties raises questions about intent and reliability. Lady Lee felt every eye in the room turn toward her, though she couldn't be certain whether this was paranoia or reality. Webb's gaze seemed to linger on her longer than necessary as he continued his presentation about operational security and need-to-know principles. The message was clear. Intellectual curiosity beyond assigned duties was being reframed as potential disloyalty. Furthermore, Webb continued, we need to be especially vigilant about personnel whose personal connections might create conflicts of interest. Family members in foreign countries, extended residence abroad, linguistic abilities that suggest ongoing foreign cultural ties. These aren't necessarily problems, but they require additional scrutiny. The room's atmosphere grew thick with unspoken accusations. Lady Lee's linguistic abilities, once seen as mildly impressive party tricks, were now being presented as indicators of questionable loyalty. Her Czech relatives, whom she saw once every few years, were transformed into potential intelligence liabilities. Her comprehensive understanding of European military thinking was recast as evidence of foreign sympathies. After the briefing, Lady Lee found herself increasingly isolated. Colleagues who had previously made small talk now avoided eye contact. Invitations to informal gatherings, already rare, disappeared entirely. Her suggestions during meetings were met with polite acknowledgement, followed by immediate topic changes, as if her input carried contamination risks. The psychological pressure intensified when Lady Lee's supervisor scheduled a routine performance review that felt more like an interrogation. Webb's office, usually a place for brief administrative discussions, became an uncomfortable examination room where Lady Lee's motivations, loyalties, and future intentions were scrutinized with prosecutorial intensity. Chun, your work quality has never been in question, Webb began, consulting a file that seemed unusually thick for a standard review. However, there have been concerns raised about your extracurricular activities. The extensive database access, the strategic planning materials, the operational scenarios, these aren't part of your assigned responsibilities. Lady Lee chose her words carefully, knowing that any response could be interpreted as defensive or evasive. Sir, I believe in being prepared for whatever responsibilities the Defense Department might assign me. Understanding strategic planning makes me more effective in my analytical role. That's admirable in theory, Webb replied, but it also raises questions about your intentions. Why would someone in intelligence analysis need to understand multi-theater operational planning? What exactly are you preparing for? The question hung between them like an accusation. Lady Lee realized that her secret preparation intended to demonstrate dedication and capability, was being interpreted as evidence of inappropriate ambition or potentially subversive intent. Her European background had transformed from a minor cultural difference into a fundamental question about her loyalty to American interests. "Sir, I'm preparing to serve my country more effectively," Lady Lee said, her voice steady despite the growing realization that her career was being systematically undermined. "I believe that comprehensive understanding makes me a more valuable asset to the Defense Department." Webb's expression suggested that he found her answer insufficient, if not troubling. The meeting concluded with vague warnings about appropriate boundaries and operational security, but Lady Lee understood that she'd been marked as a problem requiring closer supervision and eventual resolution. The morning sun felt mockingly cheerful as Lady Lee walked into the Pentagon on what would become the darkest day of her military career. It was a Tuesday in October, and the crisp autumn air carried the scent of changing leaves that reminded her of Prague autumns from her childhood. She had no way of knowing that by evening, her reputation would be in ruins and her career effectively destroyed. The ambush came during the weekly intelligence briefing, but it had been carefully orchestrated in advance. Lady Lee took her usual seat near the back of Conference Room Alpha 7, notebook ready, unaware that Colonel Webb had spent the previous evening reviewing security reports and planning what he would later describe as necessary corrective action. "Before we begin today's operational briefings," Webb announced, his voice carrying unusual formality, "I need to address a serious security concern that has come to the attention of department leadership." The room fell silent with the particular tension that preceded public disciplinary action. Lady Lee felt her stomach tighten as Webb's gaze settled on her with unmistakable intent. "Over the past several months, we've identified patterns of unauthorized access to classified strategic planning materials, operational scenarios, and command protocols that fall well outside standard analytical duties," Webb continued. "These activities have occurred during off hours, using credentials that technically allow access, but clearly violate the spirit of operational security protocols." Lady Lee's colleagues shifted uncomfortably in their seats, some stealing glances in her direction while others studiously avoided eye contact. The implication was clear even before Webb made it explicit. Major Harrison, the Harvard MBA who'd built his reputation on Lady Lee's appropriated analysis, looked particularly uncomfortable as he realized the implications of what was unfolding. "Specialist Chun," Webb said, his voice cutting through the room's uncomfortable silence like a formal indictment, "can you explain why someone in intelligence analysis would need access to multi-theater war game simulations, strategic command protocols, and operational planning modules designed for senior leadership training?" The question was loaded with assumptions about guilt and inappropriate behavior. Lady Lee stood slowly, feeling 20 pairs of eyes focused on her with the intensity of a tribunal. Her mind raced through possible responses, knowing that anything she said would be interpreted through the lens of predetermined suspicion. "Sir, I accessed those materials to better understand the strategic context of my analytical work," Lady Lee replied, her voice steady despite the crushing weight of public humiliation. "Understanding how intelligence analysis fits into broader strategic planning makes me more effective in my assigned role." "More effective," Webb repeated with evident skepticism, "or more prepared for responsibilities that haven't been assigned to you? Because that raises questions about your intentions and your understanding of appropriate boundaries within a secure military environment." Lieutenant Colonel Parks leaned forward with the expression of someone delivering a carefully prepared blow. "There's also the matter of your background, Chun. Extended family in Prague, frequent communication with foreign nationals, linguistic capabilities that suggest ongoing cultural ties to regions that aren't always aligned with American interests. Combined with this pattern of accessing strategic materials, it creates a concerning profile." The accusation landed like a physical assault. Lady Lee's European heritage, her linguistic abilities, her family connections, all transformed from biographical details into evidence of potential disloyalty. The room's atmosphere grew thick with suspicion as colleagues who'd worked alongside her for 2 years suddenly viewed her through the lens of potential security threat. "Sir, my family emigrated to the United States when I was 15, Lady Lee said, her accent seeming stronger under stress. "I became an American citizen, earned my degrees from American universities, and have served the Defense Department faithfully for 2 years. My background enhances my ability to analyze European threats, not compromise it." "That may be true," Webb replied, "but perception matters in national security work. Your pattern of behavior accessing materials beyond your clearance level, developing capabilities outside your assigned role, maintaining foreign connections, creates the appearance of someone preparing for activities that haven't been authorized by proper channels." Captain Torres, who'd benefited extensively from Lady Lee's infrastructure vulnerability analysis, joined the attack with the enthusiasm of someone deflecting attention from his own inadequacies. "I think we also need to consider the possibility that someone with divided loyalties might be gathering intelligence for purposes we haven't considered. The timing of these access patterns coincides with increased tensions in Eastern Europe." The insinuation was clear and devastating. Lady Lee's preparation for leadership responsibilities was being reframed as potential espionage activity. Her dedication to understanding strategic planning was being portrayed as information gathering for foreign interests. Her European background was being weaponized as evidence of fundamental unreliability. Furthermore, Webb continued, consulting a file that contained what appeared to be months of compiled evidence, "Your supervisors report that you've consistently pushed for assignments beyond your clearance level, questioned strategic decisions made by senior leadership, and demonstrated what can only be described as inappropriate ambition given your position and background." The character assassination was complete. Lady Lee's intellectual curiosity had become insubordination. Her comprehensive preparation had become unauthorized intelligence gathering. Her European heritage had become a liability that overshadowed her American citizenship and loyal service. The room full of colleagues who'd benefited from her insights now viewed her with suspicion and contempt. "Effective immediately," Webb announced. "Specialist Chun will be reassigned to facilities maintenance duties while security reviews her access privileges and investigates the full scope of her unauthorized activities. This reassignment will continue until we can determine whether she represents a security risk that requires additional action." The words hit Lady Lee like a physical blow. Facilities maintenance janitor duties. 2 years of exemplary service. 2 degrees from prestigious universities. Linguistic abilities that enhanced national security. Analytical skills that had identified genuine threats, all reduced to mopping floors and emptying trash cans because her preparation had been misinterpreted as subversion. As the meeting dispersed, Lady Lee remained seated, too stunned to move. The sunny October morning outside seemed to mock her devastation as she contemplated the ruins of a career she'd built through dedication and competence, destroyed by suspicion and prejudice wrapped in national security concerns. The reassignment paperwork was waiting on Lady Lee's desk when she returned to her cubicle after the most humiliating hour of her professional life. The official memorandum, signed by Colonel Webb and countersigned by the Pentagon's personnel. Security Office used clinical language to destroy her career with bureaucratic precision. Effective immediately, Intelligence Specialist Lady Lee is reassigned to Facilities Maintenance Division, Building Operations Section, pending completion of security review and assessment of professional conduct standards, the document read. All analytical duties are suspended, computer access privileges are revoked, and security clearance is temporarily downgraded pending investigation resolution. Lady Lee stared at the papers with the numb detachment of someone processing catastrophic news. 2 years of building professional credibility, months of secret preparation for greater responsibilities. A lifetime of academic achievement, all reduced to administrative action that would relegate her to custodial duties. While her colleagues whispered about her as a potential security threat, the afternoon sun streamed through the Pentagon's windows as Lady Lee cleaned out her desk under the watchful supervision of security personnel specialist Rodriguez, a stern-faced woman whose job was ensuring that potentially compromised personnel didn't access sensitive materials during their departure process. Every file Lady Lee had compiled, every analysis she'd prepared, every strategic assessment she'd developed was now considered potentially contaminated by her alleged unreliability. Personal items only, Rodriguez instructed as Lady Lee reached for a folder containing her European economic analysis. All work-related materials remain property of the Defense Department and cannot be removed by personnel under security review. Lady Lee nodded silently, placing family photographs and a small Czech flag, a gift from her grandmother, into a cardboard box that seemed pathetically small for containing the remnants of her professional identity. The walk to the facilities maintenance division felt like a perp walk through corridors where she'd once commanded respect. Colleagues who'd previously sought her expertise now avoided eye contact, some whispering behind her back about the dramatic fall of someone they'd once considered intellectually formidable. Lady Lee's security badge, once programmed for access to classified analytical databases, now granted entry only to supply closets and custodial equipment storage areas. Her new supervisor, maintenance foreman Danny Sullivan, was a 20-year Pentagon veteran whose weathered hands and practical demeanor reflected decades of keeping America's military headquarters functionally operational. Sullivan had seen dozens of reassigned personnel over the years, some seeking career changes, others serving disciplinary sentences. But Lady Lee's arrival clearly puzzled him. "Chun, right?" Sullivan asked, consulting a work assignment sheet that reduced her impressive academic credentials to a single line about previous analytical experience. "I'll be honest, I don't usually get people with your background in facilities maintenance. But whatever brought you here, I need reliable workers who can follow instructions and maintain security protocols." Lady Lee appreciated Sullivan's straightforward approach, which lacked the condescension and suspicion that had characterized her recent interactions with Pentagon leadership. "I understand, sir. I'm prepared to perform whatever duties are assigned to me." Her voice carried resignation mixed with determination. She would maintain professional standards even in dramatically reduced circumstances. The custodial duties were physically demanding but intellectually numbing. Lady Lee's days now began at 5 a.m., 2 hours earlier than her previous analytical schedule. But instead of studying strategic planning scenarios, she emptied trash bins and mopped corridors throughout the Pentagon's maze-like interior. Her linguistic abilities, once applied to interpreting foreign intelligence communications, were now useful only for understanding the occasional maintenance instructions printed in multiple languages. The irony was inescapable. Lady Lee cleaned the same conference rooms where her appropriated analysis was still being presented by colleagues who'd built their reputations on her insights. She emptied trash cans containing drafts of strategic assessments that relied heavily on frameworks she'd developed during her months of secret preparation. Her work continued to influence Pentagon decision-making, but she was now invisible to the people implementing ideas she'd originated. More painful than the physical degradation was the psychological isolation. Lady Lee's colleagues from the intelligence division avoided the areas where she worked, either from embarrassment or concern about being associated with someone under security investigation. Her attempts to maintain professional relationships were met with polite but distant responses that made clear her fall from grace had contaminated her social standing as effectively as her professional reputation. 3 weeks into her custodial Assignment: Colonel Webb summoned Lady Lee to his office for what he termed a career counseling session. The morning sun filtered through his windows as he delivered an ultimatum disguised as helpful guidance, his tone carrying the false concern of someone offering unwanted mercy. "Chun, I want to be clear about your situation," Webb began, consulting a file that documented her reassignment and ongoing security review. "Your analytical work was technically competent, but your judgment regarding appropriate boundaries has raised serious concerns about your suitability for sensitive positions within the Defense Department." Lady Lee sat silently, knowing that any response would be interpreted as defensiveness or failure to accept responsibility for actions that had been completely appropriate. Webb continued with the practiced authority of someone accustomed to crushing careers with administrative efficiency. "You have two options," he said, presenting documents that formalized her professional destruction. "First, you can accept voluntary separation from government service with a neutral performance evaluation that doesn't mention the security concerns. This would allow you to pursue private sector employment without the stigma of involuntary termination." The first option was career exile disguised as voluntary departure. Lady Lee would disappear quietly, her contributions forgotten, her potential unrealized. Webb's second option was even worse. Alternatively, you can remain in facilities maintenance indefinitely while the security review continues. However, I should warn you that investigations of this type can take years to resolve, during which time you'll remain in your current assignment with limited prospects for advancement. The ultimatum was clear: accept exile or endure indefinite professional purgatory. Either choice would end her dreams of meaningful service to her adopted country, relegating her to custodial work or civilian employment, where her strategic capabilities would never be utilized. Webb's expression suggested he expected her to choose voluntary separation, eliminating a perceived problem while avoiding the administrative complexity of formal termination. Lady Lee looked out the window at this sunny afternoon, thinking about the immigrant teenager who'd arrived in America with dreams of serving a country that valued merit over background. That idealistic girl seemed impossibly distant from the woman now being offered professional suicide as a mercy. "Sir, I need time to consider my options," Lady Lee said finally, her voice steady despite the emotional devastation of watching her career reduced to an administrative inconvenience. Webb nodded with satisfaction, clearly confident that reflection would lead to the resignation that would solve his personnel problem. That evening, as Lady Lee mopped the corridors of the building where she'd once analyzed threats to American security, she made a decision that would change everything. She wouldn't accept exile, and she wouldn't endure indefinite purgatory. Instead, she would do what she'd always done: prepare for opportunities that others couldn't imagine, and prove that underestimating her capabilities was a strategic mistake. The crisis began at 3:47 a.m. on a Tuesday morning in November, when coordinated cyber attacks struck 7 critical defense installations simultaneously across the continental United States. Lady Lee was mopping the floors of Conference Room Alpha 7, the same room where she'd been publicly humiliated 6 weeks earlier, when the emergency alert system shattered the Pentagon's pre-dawn quiet with piercing alarms that meant only one thing: America was under attack. Red emergency lighting bathed the corridors as Lady Lee abandoned her mop bucket and moved toward the nearest information display. The initial reports were fragmentary but alarming. Norfolk Naval Base's communication systems were down. Peterson Air Force Base had lost satellite connectivity, and Fort Bragg's logistics network was completely compromised. Each targeted installation housed critical infrastructure for America's global military operations. Within minutes, the Pentagon transformed from a quietly humming administrative building into a crisis command center. Senior officers rushed through corridors that Lady Lee knew intimately from her custodial duties, their faces reflecting the gravity of confronting America's first major coordinated cyber warfare attack. Emergency protocols activated systems that Lady Lee had studied during her secret preparation months earlier, but never imagined she'd witness in real crisis conditions. The morning sun was beginning to rise as Lady Lee positioned herself near Conference Room Alpha 7, where she could observe the developing crisis response without interfering with official operations. Through the partially open door, she watched Colonel Webb coordinating with senior leadership as damage reports continued flooding in from attacked installations. The scope of the assault was becoming clear. This wasn't random hacking, but sophisticated, military-grade cyber warfare designed to cripple American defense capabilities. "We've lost communication with 3 major installations," Major Harrison reported, his Harvard MBA credentials providing little preparation for managing a crisis that required technical expertise and strategic thinking. "The attacks appear coordinated, but we're having difficulty determining the source or predicting the next targets." Lady Lee listened with growing alarm as she recognized the attack patterns from scenarios she'd studied during her months of secret preparation. The targeting methodology, the timing coordination, the systematic approach to disrupting communication networks all matched theoretical frameworks from advanced cyber warfare simulations that few Pentagon personnel had access to or understood comprehensively. Lieutenant Colonel Parks was struggling to coordinate with affected installations, her media-friendly presentation skills inadequate for managing real-time crisis communications. "Sir, we're unable to establish secure channels with Norfolk or Peterson. Whatever hit them is maintaining persistent access to their systems. We need technical expertise that's currently unavailable." The crisis deepened as reports arrived of secondary attacks targeting backup communication systems and alternate command protocols. Someone with intimate knowledge of American military infrastructure was systematically dismantling the network connections that enabled coordinated defense operations. This wasn't opportunistic hacking, it was strategic warfare designed to blind and isolate American military forces. Captain Torres, whose operational planning relied heavily on the technological systems now under attack, appeared overwhelmed by the technical complexity of cyber warfare defense. "Sir, our current protocols assume that communication systems remain operational. If we can't coordinate with field installations, we're essentially operating blind." Lady Lee realized with growing horror that the Pentagon's crisis response team, despite their impressive credentials and traditional military training, lacked the technical expertise and strategic framework necessary to counter sophisticated cyber warfare. Their conventional military education hadn't prepared them for an enemy that attacked through computer networks rather than traditional battlefield engagement. The attacks escalated as Lady Lee watched through the conference room door. Fort Hood's personnel databases were compromised, potentially exposing operational security information about deployed forces. Vandenberg Air Force Base lost control of satellite tracking systems, creating gaps in America's space-based surveillance capabilities. Each successful attack built upon previous breaches, creating cascading failures that paralyzed increasingly critical defense functions. "We need someone who understands both the technical aspects of these attacks and the strategic implications for national defense," Colonel Webb announced with evident frustration. "Our current personnel are expert in traditional military operations, but this requires capabilities we apparently don't have readily available." Lady Lee's heart hammered as she realized the crisis was outpacing the Pentagon's ability to respond effectively. The cyber attacks were succeeding because America's military leadership, despite their impressive traditional credentials, lacked comprehensive understanding of modern technological warfare. They were fighting a 21st century conflict with 20th century strategic thinking. The morning sun streamed through the Pentagon's windows as Lady Lee made a decision that would change her life forever. She understood these attack patterns, had studied the defensive frameworks necessary to counter them, and possessed the technical and strategic knowledge that the crisis response team desperately needed. Everyone in that conference room had dismissed her as an overambitious foreign-born analyst whose capabilities didn't match her ambitions. They were about to discover that underestimating her had been a catastrophic mistake that could cost American lives and compromise national security. Lady Lee straightened her custodial uniform, abandoned her cleaning supplies, and walked toward the conference room where America's military leadership was struggling to defend their country against an enemy they didn't understand. Lady Lee stood in the doorway of Conference Room Alpha 7, her custodial uniform a stark contrast to the military dress uniforms of the officers, frantically trying to coordinate America's cyber defense response. The morning sun illuminated a scene of controlled chaos as senior leadership grappled with an attack that was evolving faster than their ability to comprehend or counter it. Colonel Webb looked up from a communication display showing cascading system failures across multiple installations, his expression reflecting the frustration of someone accustomed to clear chains of command confronting an enemy that operated outside traditional military frameworks. "Chun, what are you doing here? Facilities personnel should be maintaining normal operations unless specifically requested." "Sir, I believe I can help with the cyber attack response," Lady Lee said, her voice steady despite the magnitude of what she was proposing. Around the conference table, officers who dismissed her as an overambitious analyst now stared with expressions ranging from confusion to irritation. The idea that a demoted janitor could contribute to national crisis management seemed absurd. To people who measured capability by rank and traditional credentials, Harrison was the first to voice what everyone was thinking. "Chun, this is a strategic crisis requiring senior-level expertise in cyber warfare and military operations. With all due respect, custodial personnel aren't qualified to participate in national defense planning." His tone carried the condescending patience reserved for well-meaning but misguided subordinates who failed to understand their limitations. "I recognize the attack patterns," Lady Lee continued, ignoring the dismissive atmosphere that filled the room like smoke. "The targeting methodology matches scenarios from advanced cyber warfare simulations. The attackers are using a systematic approach to isolate communication networks and create cascading failures in backup systems." Lieutenant Colonel Parks interrupted with evident irritation. "Chun, we appreciate your interest in helping, but this crisis requires immediate action from qualified personnel, not theoretical analysis from someone whose security clearance has been revoked. Please return to your assigned duties." Lady Lee felt the familiar burn of dismissal, but this time the stakes extended far beyond her personal career ambitions. American military installations were under systematic attack, and the response team was struggling with concepts she'd studied extensively during her months of secret preparation. National security was being compromised while qualified personnel insisted on following protocols that prioritized credentials over capabilities. "Sir, the next phase will target logistics databases and personnel systems," Lady Lee said, her voice growing stronger as she recognized attack patterns unfolding. Exactly as theoretical frameworks predicted. The attackers are building access to critical infrastructure that will allow them to compromise operational security for deployed forces worldwide. Colonel Webb's expression shifted from irritation to reluctant attention as Lady Lee's prediction aligned with incoming reports of exactly the type of secondary attacks she'd described. Fort Benning's logistics systems had just gone offline, and Ramstein Air Base was reporting database intrusions that matched her forecast with unsettling accuracy. "How could you possibly know that?" Captain Torres asked, his skepticism warring. With growing concern about Lady Lee's apparent understanding of attack patterns that had caught Pentagon leadership completely off guard. "These are sophisticated military-grade cyber attacks. What makes you think you understand enemy strategy better than trained intelligence professionals?" Lady Lee made a decision that would either vindicate her months of preparation or confirm her colleague's assessment that she'd overestimated her capabilities. Because I've studied every major cyber warfare scenario developed by the Defense Department over the past 2 years. I understand the attack vectors, the defensive frameworks, and the strategic implications of systematic infrastructure compromise. The room fell silent except for the persistent beeping of emergency communication systems and the distant sound of military personnel responding to escalating crisis conditions. Lady Lee's colleagues stared at her with expressions that mixed disbelief with growing recognition that someone they'd dismissed as professionally irrelevant might possess exactly the expertise that America's defense required. "That's impossible," Webb said finally. "You're intelligence analysis personnel, not cyber warfare specialists. And you've been reassigned to facilities maintenance for the past 6 weeks. When would you have had access to advanced strategic scenarios? During the months when you thought I was inappropriately accessing materials beyond my clearance level." Lady Lee replied, her European accent seeming stronger under stress. "When you decided my preparation for greater responsibilities was evidence of questionable loyalty rather than professional dedication." The implications of her statement settled over the conference room like a thunderclap. The same activities that had led to her demotion and security investigation, accessing strategic planning materials, studying operational scenarios, developing comprehensive understanding of cyber warfare defense, had inadvertently prepared her for exactly the crisis that was now overwhelming America's conventional military leadership. Major Harrison's face reflected dawning understanding mixed with professional embarrassment. "You're saying that while we were questioning your motivations for studying strategic planning, you were actually developing expertise that we now desperately need." "I'm saying that I spent months preparing for responsibilities that I hope to earn through demonstrated competence," Lady Lee replied. "I studied cyber warfare defense because I believed modern military leadership required technical expertise. I analyzed attack scenarios because I wanted to understand how to protect American interests against evolving threats." Lieutenant Colonel Parks looked between Lady Lee and the emergency displays showing spreading system failures across military installations worldwide. "Even if that's true, Chun, your facility's maintenance personnel with revoked security clearance. We can't simply ignore proper protocols because of a crisis." "Ma'am, with respect," Lady Lee said, her voice carrying the quiet authority of someone who understood exactly what was at stake. "America is under attack by enemies who don't care about our protocols. The question isn't whether I have proper clearance, it's whether my knowledge can help save American lives and protect national security." Colonel Webb stared at Lady Lee for a long moment, then at the displays showing cascading failures across America's military infrastructure. The next decision would determine whether institutional pride was more important than national survival, whether following proper channels mattered more than stopping an enemy that was systematically dismantling America's defense capabilities. Morning sun continued streaming through the Pentagon's windows as America's military leadership confronted the possibility that their most valuable asset in defending the country was someone they'd demoted to mopping floors. Colonel Webb stared at the emergency displays showing red indicators spreading across America's military infrastructure like a digital infection. Norfolk Naval Base had lost all external communications. Peterson Air Force Base's satellite systems remained compromised, and now Fort Hood's personnel databases were being systematically accessed by unknown attackers. The crisis was escalating beyond the Pentagon's ability to respond effectively through conventional protocols. "Chun," Webb said finally, his voice carrying the weight of a decision that could define his career, "explain exactly what you think is happening and what you believe needs to be done to stop it." Lady Lee moved toward the tactical display, her custodial uniform incongruous among the military dress uniforms of senior officers who were reluctantly acknowledging that rank and credentials might be less important than actual expertise. Morning sun illuminated maps showing compromised installations as she began explaining. Attack patterns that she'd studied in theoretical scenarios, but never imagined confronting in reality. The attackers are using a multi-phase approach designed to isolate and blind our military infrastructure. Lady Li began, her voice steady despite the magnitude of addressing senior leadership who'd spent weeks undermining her credibility. Phase 1 targeted primary communication systems to prevent coordination between installations. Phase 2 is compromising backup networks to ensure persistent access. Phase 3 will target logistics and personnel systems to gather intelligence. For future operations, Major Harrison leaned forward, his Harvard MBA education providing no framework for understanding cyber warfare at this level of sophistication. Assuming you're correct about their strategy, what's the timeline? How long do we have before they complete Phase 3? Lady Li studied the pattern of attacks, applying analytical skills that had been dismissed as inappropriate academic curiosity. When applied to strategic planning scenarios, based on the progression rate and the systematic approach, we have approximately 4 hours before they gain access to classified personnel databases that could compromise operational security for every deployed American force worldwide. The room's atmosphere grew heavier as the implications became clear. This wasn't just a cyber attack, it was intelligence gathering that could expose American military personnel to targeted assassination, compromise covert operations, and provide enemy forces with detailed knowledge of American military capabilities and deployment patterns. Lieutenant Colonel Parks, whose media-friendly presentations had never prepared her for managing real crisis situations, asked the question that everyone was thinking. Even if your analysis is correct, Chun, what can we do? Our cyber warfare specialists are at NSA headquarters. Our technical experts are scattered across multiple installations, and our normal response protocols assume functional communication systems. Lady Li took a breath that felt like crossing the Rubicon, knowing that her next words would either save her career or complete its destruction. I can stop them. I've studied the defensive frameworks necessary to counter systematic cyber attacks. I understand the network architectures they're exploiting and the countermeasures that can isolate their access points. The silence that followed was broken only by the persistent beeping of emergency alerts and the distant sound of military personnel implementing crisis protocols that were proving inadequate for the technological sophistication of the attack. Lady Li's colleagues stared at her with expressions that mixed desperation with deep skepticism about whether someone they'd relegated to custodial duties could possibly possess the capabilities to defend America against military-grade cyber warfare. Captain Torres voiced the concerns that everyone shared. Chun, you're talking about taking direct action against enemy cyber operations. That requires not just theoretical knowledge, but hands-on technical expertise and security clearances that you no longer possess. How can we authorize someone under security investigation to access the very systems that are under attack? Because the alternative is watching those systems be systematically compromised while we follow protocols designed for conventional threats, Lady Li replied. This attack is succeeding because our response assumes that proper channels and traditional expertise will be sufficient. The enemy is counting on our bureaucratic limitations to prevent effective defense. Colonel Webb studied Lady Li with the expression of someone calculating risks that could define not just his career, but America's national security. Chun, what exactly are you proposing? What would you need to implement the defensive measures you're describing? Lady Li felt the weight of the moment. Everything she'd prepared for during months of secret study. Every skill she'd developed while being dismissed as inappropriately ambitious. Every capability she'd built while others questioned her loyalty and competence. I need access to the Pentagon Central Network Operations Center, authorization to implement emergency protocols, and the authority to coordinate directly with compromised installations. The request was staggering in its implications. Lady Li was asking for complete access to America's most sensitive cyber infrastructure, authority to make decisions that could affect global military operations, and the power to implement defensive measures that could either save or cripple American defense capabilities. She was asking to be trusted with responsibilities that traditional career progression would never have granted someone of her rank and background. Absolutely not, Park said immediately. We cannot authorize someone whose security clearance has been revoked to access critical defense systems. The protocols exist for valid reasons, and circumventing them could create security vulnerabilities that are worse than the current attack. Ma'am, Lady Lee replied, her voice carrying quiet authority that commanded attention despite her custodial uniform. The protocols were designed for threats that followed conventional patterns. This attack is succeeding precisely because our enemies understand our limitations better than we understand theirs. Webb looked at the displays showing spreading system failures, then at Lady Lee's confident expression, then at his senior staff whose impressive credentials had proven inadequate for defending America against an enemy that operated outside traditional military frameworks. The decision would either vindicate his judgment or destroy his career, but America's national security hung in the balance. Chun, he said finally, you have 1 hour to prove that your unconventional expertise can stop this attack. If you succeed, we'll discuss your future with this department. If you fail, you'll face court-martial for unauthorized access to classified systems during a national security crisis. Lady Lee nodded, understanding that she'd just crossed a point of no return. Everything she'd prepared for, everything she'd sacrificed, everything she'd endured during weeks of professional humiliation, it all came down to the next hour. She would either save America's military infrastructure or destroy what remained of her career in spectacular failure. The morning sun continued streaming through the Pentagon's windows as Lady Lee walked toward the Network Operations Center, knowing that the next 60 minutes would determine whether being underestimated had been America's greatest vulnerability or its secret weapon. The Pentagon's Network Operations Center was a cathedral of technology, its walls lined with displays showing real-time data from military installations worldwide. Lady Lee entered with her temporary access credentials, knowing that every keystroke would be monitored and that failure would result in not just personal disgrace, but potential compromise of America's national security. The morning sun filtered through reinforced windows as she approached workstations that normally required years of specialized training and highest-level security clearances to operate. Senior Technician Marcus Rodriguez looked up from his console with barely concealed skepticism as Lady Lee approached. Rodriguez had spent 15 years managing Pentagon cyber operations, and the idea of a demoted janitor attempting to counter sophisticated military-grade attacks struck him as somewhere between desperate and insane. Ma'am, Colonel Webb said, you're authorized to access primary defense networks, but I have to tell you, these systems are beyond anything civilian analysts typically encounter. I understand the gravity of the situation, Lady Lee replied, settling into a workstation that controlled access to communication networks spanning 6 continents. The technical interfaces were exactly as she'd studied during her months of secret preparation, but experiencing them in a real crisis carried weight that no simulation could replicate. Can you show me the current attack vectors and system penetration patterns? Rodriguez pulled up displays that resembled a digital battlefield, with red indicators showing compromised systems and blue lines representing functional communication channels that were shrinking by the minute. The attackers are using sophisticated persistence methods. Even when we think we've closed access points, they maintain hidden connections that re-establish control. It's like fighting smoke. Lady Lee studied the attack patterns with growing recognition. The methodologies matched scenarios from advanced cyber warfare simulations almost exactly, but with refinements that suggested real-world testing and adaptation. They're using a distributed approach that creates redundant access points across Multiple network segments. Traditional defensive measures fail because they assume linear attack patterns. Exactly, Rodriguez agreed, his skepticism giving way to cautious interest as Lady Lee demonstrated understanding of technical concepts that typically required years of specialized education. We've tried isolating compromised systems, but the attackers have already established secondary access points that activate when primary connections are severed. Lady Lee began implementing defensive measures that she'd studied theoretically, but never executed in real crisis conditions. Her fingers moved across the keyboard with growing confidence as she accessed protocols designed for exactly this type of systematic infrastructure attack. We need to implement network segmentation that isolates critical functions while maintaining essential communications. The key is creating barriers that force the attackers to reveal their access methods. The first phase of Lady Lee's defense involved systematically isolating compromised network segments while establishing secure communication channels that bypassed infected infrastructure. Her approach was counterintuitive. Instead of trying to expel the attackers immediately, she was creating controlled environments where their activities could be monitored and their methods analyzed. "Ma'am, you're essentially creating digital quarantine zones," Rodriguez observed, watching Lady Lee implement network architectures that he'd studied in advanced training scenarios but never seen deployed in real operations. This could work, but it requires coordinating with every affected installation simultaneously. One mistake could isolate critical systems permanently. Lady Lee was acutely aware of the stakes as she began coordinating with compromised installations through newly established secure channels. Each connection required technical expertise that combined traditional network administration with strategic understanding of military operational requirements. Her months of studying both technical protocols and strategic planning were proving essential for managing the complexity of real-world cyber defense. Norfolk Naval Base was the first installation to respond to Lady Lee's coordination attempts. Pentagon Network Operations, this is Norfolk IT Command. We're receiving your segmentation protocols, but implementing them will temporarily shut down all external communications. Confirm authorization for complete communications blackout. Lady Lee made a decision that could either save or cripple Norfolk's operational capabilities. Norfolk, authorization confirmed. Implement full segmentation and report status through secure secondary channels. She was essentially gambling that temporary isolation would prevent permanent compromise, betting America's military readiness on theoretical frameworks that she'd never tested in real conditions. Peterson Air Force Base presented even greater challenges. Their satellite communication systems were so deeply compromised that implementing Lady Lee's defensive measures required shutting down space-based surveillance capabilities for the entire western United States. Pentagon NOC, Peterson. Here, your protocols require taking our satellite tracking offline for estimated 45 minutes. This creates gaps in missile defense coverage. The weight of responsibility was crushing. Lady Lee was making decisions that affected America's ability to defend against ballistic missile attacks, coordinate global military operations, and maintain surveillance of potential threats worldwide. Every choice carried consequences that could cascade into strategic vulnerabilities, but the alternative was watching enemy forces systematically compromise America's entire military infrastructure. Peterson, implement segmentation protocols. Immediately, Lady Lee commanded, her voice carrying authority that surprised even herself. Temporary surveillance gaps are preferable to permanent enemy access to satellite control systems. Fort Hood's response revealed the true sophistication of the enemy attack. Pentagon NAC, Fort Hood IT reporting. The attackers anticipated segmentation countermeasures. We're detecting adaptive responses that are attempting to circumvent your isolation protocols in real time. Lady Lee felt a chill of recognition as she realized The enemy wasn't just using pre-planned attack strategies, they were actively adapting to her defensive measures as she implemented them. This level of sophistication suggested state-sponsored cyber warfare capabilities that could counter American defensive responses faster than traditional protocols could implement them. All stations switched to adaptive defense protocols, Lady Lee announced, implementing measures that she'd studied in the most advanced cyber warfare scenarios available to Pentagon analysts. She was essentially improvising countermeasures against an enemy that possessed capabilities equal to or superior to America's most sophisticated cyber defense systems. The morning sun continued streaming through the Network Operations Center as Lady Lee fought a digital battle that would determine whether America's military infrastructure could be defended against enemies who understood American weaknesses better than America understood its own capabilities. Every keystroke was a strategic decision that could save or doom American forces deployed around the world. Rodriguez watched with growing amazement as Lady Lee coordinated defensive measures across multiple theaters simultaneously, her theoretical knowledge proving applicable to real-world crisis conditions that had overwhelmed Pentagon leadership. "Ma'am, I've been doing this for 15 years, and I've never seen anyone implement defensive protocols this complex under crisis conditions." Lady Lee didn't respond. Her attention focused entirely on the digital battlefield where America's national security was being determined by her ability to outthink enemies who had spent months planning systematic attacks against infrastructure that she was defending through preparation that everyone had dismissed as inappropriate ambition. Real test was just beginning. The cyber warfare battlefield evolved with terrifying speed as Lady Lee implemented defensive measures that required split-second decisions across multiple theaters simultaneously. Her workstation displayed data streams from 17 compromised military installations, each showing different attack vectors that demanded unique countermeasures. The morning sun had given way to overcast skies, but inside the Network Operations Center, Lady Lee's focus remained laser-sharp on digital combat that would determine America's military readiness. "Pentagon NOC, this is Ramstein Air Base," crackled. "Through secure communications, the attackers are using our own administrative protocols against us. They've gained access to personnel databases and are attempting to correlate deployment information with family contact details. This could compromise operational security for every American service member in Europe." Lady Lee's fingers flew across the keyboard as she implemented countermeasures that combined technical network security with strategic understanding of military operational requirements. Her months of secret preparation had included studying not just cyber defense protocols, but the military infrastructure that those protocols were designed to protect. This comprehensive knowledge was proving essential for defending systems that required both technical expertise and strategic awareness. "Ramstein, implement Protocol 7 Alpha immediately," Lady Lee commanded, her voice carrying the authority of someone who understood exactly what was at stake. "Lock down all personnel databases and establish air-gapped backup systems for critical deployment information. Accept no external database queries, regardless of apparent authorization level." Senior Technician Rodriguez watched with growing amazement as Lady Lee coordinated defensive operations that he'd never seen implemented outside of advanced simulation exercises. "Ma'am, Protocol 7 Alpha requires manually isolating database servers across 3 continents simultaneously. The coordination complexity is beyond what we typically attempt during crisis conditions." "The complexity is why it works," Lady Lee replied, monitoring confirmation signals from Ramstein while simultaneously directing defensive measures at Fort Bragg and Naval Station Norfolk. "The attackers are using systematic approaches that assume we'll implement predictable defensive measures. Protocol 7 Alpha forces them to adapt to countermeasures they haven't prepared for. Her prediction proved accurate as attack patterns began shifting in response to her defensive measures. The enemy cyber warfare teams were clearly sophisticated, but Lady Lee's unconventional approach was disrupting their planned progression through American military infrastructure. Instead of following predictable defensive protocols, she was implementing measures that forced the attackers to reveal capabilities they'd intended to keep hidden. Pentagon knock. Fort Benning reporting successful implementation of adaptive isolation protocols. Came the next update. We're detecting attempted intrusion through secondary access points, but your segmentation measures are preventing lateral movement through our networks. Lady Lee's success at Fort Benning enabled her to refine defensive measures for other installations facing similar attack patterns. Her approach was iterative. Each successful defense provided intelligence that improved countermeasures at other locations. This adaptive methodology was exactly what traditional Pentagon cyber defense protocols had been unable to implement effectively. All stations prepare for coordinated counteroffensive operations, Lady Lee announced, transitioning from purely defensive measures to active disruption of enemy cyber operations. Her preparation had included studying not just how to defend against cyber attacks, but how to trace attack vectors back to their sources and neutralize them at the point of origin. The counteroffensive phase required capabilities that combined technical expertise with strategic thinking at levels that typically took years to develop. Lady Lee was implementing measures in real time that cyber warfare specialists normally planned for weeks before executing. Her theoretical knowledge was proving applicable to real-world conditions in ways that surprised even herself. Ma'am, you're simultaneously coordinating defensive operations at 14 installations while implementing active countermeasures against enemy systems, Rodriguez observed, his voice reflecting professional admiration mixed with disbelief. I've never seen anyone manage this level of operational complexity under crisis conditions. Lady Lee's success was becoming undeniable as installation after installation reported successful implementation of her defensive measures. Norfolk Naval Base had re-established secure communications. Peterson Air Force Base was bringing satellite systems back online with hardened security protocols. And Fort Hood had successfully expelled enemy access while preserving critical logistics. Networks. The most sophisticated challenge came from Yokota Air Base in Japan, where the attackers had implemented persistent access methods that survived traditional defensive measures. Pentagon knock. Yokota reporting that enemy systems are adapting to our countermeasures faster than we can implement them. They appear to have predictive capabilities that anticipate our defensive responses. Lady Lee recognized this as the critical test of her capabilities. The enemy was using artificial intelligence to adapt to her defensive measures in real time, requiring countermeasures that could outthink machine learning algorithms designed specifically to defeat American cyber defense systems. Yokota, implement Chaos Protocol Delta, Lady Lee commanded, accessing the most advanced countermeasures from her months of preparation. Randomize all defensive responses using protocols that cannot be predicted by machine learning systems. Force the enemy algorithms to respond to genuinely unpredictable defensive measures. The implementation of Chaos Protocol Delta required Lady Lee to coordinate defensive measures that intentionally violated standard cybersecurity practices, creating apparent vulnerabilities that were actually sophisticated traps for enemy systems. It was cyber warfare at its most advanced level, requiring strategic thinking that combined technical expertise with psychological understanding of how enemy analysts would interpret apparently contradictory defensive measures. Pentagon NOC. Yokota reporting successful implementation of Chaos Protocol Delta. Enemy systems appear confused by apparently contradictory defensive measures. We're detecting systematic withdrawal from our networks. Lady Lee had successfully defended American military infrastructure against the most sophisticated cyber attack in the nation's history. using knowledge and capabilities that everyone had dismissed as inappropriate academic curiosity. Her months of secret preparation had proven essential for defending America against enemies who understood conventional defensive limitations better than America understood its own capabilities. The morning's crisis was ending with American military infrastructure not just defended, but strengthened through implementation of advanced defensive measures that would prevent similar attacks in the future. The Network Operations Center buzzed with controlled energy as Lady Lee completed the final phase of America's cyber defense operation. Displays that had shown cascading red failure indicators 6 hours earlier now displayed steady green confirmations from military installations worldwide. The overcast afternoon sky outside seemed brighter as Lady Lee initiated the last series of security protocols that would ensure the morning's successful defense translated into permanent protection against future attacks. All stations, this is Pentagon NOC. Lady Lee announced through secure communications channels that now reached every major American military installation. Confirm implementation of hardened security protocols and report operational status for critical systems. Her voice carried the quiet authority of someone who had proven capabilities that nobody had imagined she possessed. The responses came in rapid succession, each confirmation representing successful defense of American military infrastructure that had been systematically compromised just hours earlier. Norfolk Naval Base reported full restoration of secure communications with enhanced protective measures. Peterson Air Force Base confirmed that satellite systems were operational with advanced intrusion detection protocols. Fort Hood verified that logistics networks were functioning with multi-layered security that prevented the type of systematic compromise that had characterized the morning's attacks. Senior Technician Rodriguez stood behind Lady Lee's workstation, shaking his head with professional amazement as he watched her coordinate post-crisis security implementation across 6 continents. "Ma'am, in 15 years of Pentagon cyber operations, I've never seen anyone manage a crisis of this magnitude, let alone implement comprehensive countermeasures that actually improved our overall security posture." Colonel Webb entered the network Operations Center as Lady Lee completed the final security verification protocols. His expression reflected the complex mixture of relief, embarrassment, and grudging respect that characterized someone whose assumptions about personnel capabilities had been proven catastrophically wrong. Behind him walked Major Harrison, Lieutenant Colonel Parks, and Captain Torres, the same officers who had dismissed Lady Lee as an over-ambitious foreign-born analyst whose preparation exceeded her assigned responsibilities. "Chun," Webb said, his voice carrying none of the condescension that had characterized their previous interactions. "I need a complete briefing on what you've accomplished and how you managed to counter attacks that overwhelmed our conventional defense capabilities." Lady Lee turned from her workstation, her custodial uniform incongruous among the high-tech displays that showed successful defense of America's most critical military infrastructure. "Sir, the attacks were successful initially because they exploited gaps between technical cybersecurity protocols and strategic understanding of military operational requirements. Traditional defensive measures failed because they addressed technical vulnerabilities without considering broader operational implications." Major Harrison, whose Harvard MBA credentials had proven inadequate for managing real crisis conditions, leaned forward with evident interest. "You're saying that our cyber defense protocols were technically sound but strategically insufficient?" "Exactly," Lady Lee replied, accessing displays that showed the attack progression and her defensive countermeasures. "The enemy understood that American cyber defense protocols were designed by technical specialists who lacked comprehensive understanding of military operational requirements. They exploited gaps between technical capability and strategic application." Lieutenant Colonel Parks, whose media-friendly presentations had never prepared her for managing technological crisis situations, asked the question that everyone was considering. How did you develop the expertise to coordinate defensive measures that our specialized personnel couldn't implement? Lady Lee's answer carried the quiet pride of someone whose preparation had been vindicated through successful application under the most demanding conditions possible. I spent months studying both cyber warfare protocols and strategic military planning because I believed that effective defense required understanding both technical capabilities and operational requirements. My background analyzing European threats provided perspective on how enemies might exploit American defensive limitations. The briefing continued as Lady Lee explained defensive measures that combined technical network security with strategic understanding of global military operations. Her European perspective, once considered a potential liability, had proven essential for understanding how enemies from different cultural backgrounds might approach systematic attacks on American infrastructure. Captain Torres, whose operational planning had relied heavily on Lady Lee's previous analytical work, looked between the successful defense displays and Lady Lee's confident explanations. Chun, you're describing capabilities that typically require years of specialized training and highest-level security clearances. How were you able to develop this expertise while assigned to intelligence analysis duties? I developed this expertise during the period when you decided my access to strategic planning materials was evidence of questionable loyalty rather than professional dedication. Lady Lee replied, her tone matter-of-fact rather than accusatory. My months of studying advanced scenarios prepared me for exactly the type of crisis that overwhelmed conventional response capabilities this morning. The room fell silent as the implications settled over Pentagon leadership who had spent weeks undermining Lady Lee's credibility and questioning her motivations. The same activities that had led to her demotion and security investigation accessing strategic planning materials, studying operational scenarios, developing comprehensive understanding of cyber warfare defense, had inadvertently prepared her to save American military infrastructure from the most sophisticated attack in the nation's history. Colonel Webb studied the displays showing successful defense operations that had exceeded every expectation of what was possible under crisis conditions. Chun, you've demonstrated capabilities that far exceed your assigned responsibilities and formal training. Your performance today suggests that our assessment of your potential was incomplete. Rodriguez stepped forward with the perspective of someone whose technical expertise had been supplemented by Lady Lee's strategic thinking throughout the crisis. Sir, Specialist Chun coordinated defensive operations across multiple theaters simultaneously while implementing countermeasures that I've never seen executed under real-world conditions. Her performance was exceptional by any standard. Lady Lee felt a satisfaction that had nothing to do with personal vindication and everything to do with successful service to her adopted country. Sir, I'm grateful for the opportunity to serve American interests using whatever capabilities I've been able to develop. This morning's crisis demonstrated that preparedness and determination can overcome apparent limitations when national security is at stake. The afternoon sun was beginning to filter through the overcast sky as Pentagon leadership confronted the reality that their most effective cyber defense specialist was someone they demoted to custodial duties based on misconceptions about loyalty, capability, and appropriate ambition. 6 months later, Lady Lee stood before the same conference room Alpha 7, where she'd been publicly humiliated and demoted to janitor duties. But everything had changed. The morning sun streamed through Pentagon windows as she prepared to address a gathering that included the Secretary of Defense, the Chairman of the Joint Chiefs of Staff, and senior military leadership from every branch of the armed forces. Her new uniform bore insignia that reflected her unprecedented rise from custodial duties to the Pentagon's newly created position of Director of Integrated Cyber Defense. Secretary of Defense Patricia Lawson opened the ceremony with remarks that acknowledge the transformation in America's approach to cyber warfare defense. 6 months ago, we learned that our traditional methods of evaluating personnel capabilities were inadequate for identifying the expertise necessary to defend America against 21st century threats. Today, we recognize someone whose unconventional preparation and dedication saved American military infrastructure from the most sophisticated attack in our nation's history. The audience included many of the same officers who had dismissed Lady Lee as an overambitious foreign-born analyst whose capabilities didn't match her ambitions. Colonel Webb sat in the front row, his expression reflecting the complex emotions of someone whose career had been defined by traditional military thinking that had proven inadequate for modern warfare challenges. Major Harrison, Lieutenant Colonel Parks, and Captain Torres occupied seats nearby, their previous skepticism replaced by professional respect earned through Lady Lee's demonstrated competence under crisis conditions. Chairman of the Joint Chiefs, Admiral Patricia Chun, took the podium to announce Lady Lee's formal recognition and new responsibilities. Director Chun has been selected to lead America's most ambitious cyber defense initiative, a comprehensive program that integrates technical capabilities with strategic thinking across all branches of military service. Her approach combines traditional military expertise with innovative defensive measures that anticipate enemy capabilities rather than merely responding to them. Lady Lee approached the podium wearing the insignia of a position that had been created specifically to utilize her unique combination of technical expertise, strategic thinking, and comprehensive understanding of global military operations. Her European background, once considered a potential liability, was now recognized as providing essential perspective for understanding how enemies from different cultural contexts might approach systematic attacks on American infrastructure. 6 months ago, I was mopping floors in this very building while America's military infrastructure came under the most sophisticated cyber attack in our nation's history. Lady Lee began, her voice carrying the quiet authority of someone whose capabilities had been proven under the most demanding conditions possible. Today, I'm honored to lead defensive programs that ensure such attacks will never again threaten American military readiness. The ceremony continued with presentations about the integrated cyber defense program that Lady Lee had developed based on lessons learned from the morning crisis that had changed her life. Her approach combined technical network security with strategic understanding of military operational requirements, creating defensive capabilities that anticipated enemy actions rather than merely responding to them. The program's success was already evident in measurable improvements to American cybersecurity posture. Military installations worldwide had implemented Lady Lee's hardened security protocols, creating defensive capabilities that exceeded previous standards by orders of magnitude. Enemy cyber reconnaissance activities had declined dramatically as potential attackers recognized that American defensive capabilities now exceeded their ability to exploit systematic vulnerabilities. More importantly, Lady Lee's example had transformed Pentagon thinking about personnel evaluation and capability recognition. The crisis had demonstrated that traditional metrics for assessing leadership potential, rank, background, cultural fit were inadequate for identifying the expertise necessary to defend America against evolving threats that didn't respect conventional military boundaries. Director Chun's success has led to comprehensive review of our personnel development programs. Secretary Lawson announced, "We're implementing new approaches that recognize and develop unconventional expertise rather than limiting advancement opportunities to personnel who fit traditional leadership profiles." The changes extended throughout Pentagon culture as Lady Lee's vindication inspired other personnel whose capabilities had been underestimated due to background, appearance, or unconventional preparation. Her example demonstrated that dedication and comprehensive preparation could overcome institutional biases that had previously limited opportunities for advancement. Based on superficial characteristics rather than actual competence, Lady Lee's new responsibilities included not just cyber defense coordination, but development of strategic thinking capabilities throughout American military leadership. Her approach emphasized comprehensive preparation that combined technical expertise with strategic understanding, creating military leaders who could adapt to threats that exceeded conventional expectations. The ceremony concluded with Lady Lee receiving recognition that acknowledged her transition from dismissed analyst to essential military leader. The same conference room where she'd been demoted to custodial duties now hosted celebration of achievements that had redefined American cyber defense capabilities and transformed institutional thinking about leadership potential. As the gathering dispersed, Lady Lee reflected on the journey that had brought her from Prague teenager to Pentagon leadership. The immigrant experience that had taught her to navigate multiple worlds while belonging fully to none had proven essential for understanding threats that transcended traditional military categories. Her European perspective had provided insights that purely American military thinking couldn't achieve. The afternoon sun illuminated the Pentagon's corridors as Lady Lee walked toward her new office, the same building where she'd once emptied trash cans while dreaming of opportunities to serve her adopted country more meaningfully. Her story had become inspiration for military personnel worldwide who understood that preparation and determination could overcome apparent limitations when national security was at stake. Colonel Webb approached as Lady Lee reached her office, his expression reflecting the mixture of professional respect and personal embarrassment that characterized someone whose assumptions had been proven wrong through dramatic real-world consequences. Director Chun, I owe you an apology and an acknowledgement. Your dedication and preparation saved American military infrastructure when our conventional approaches failed. Sir, we all serve according to our capabilities and opportunities, Lady Lee replied graciously. The important thing is that America's security was preserved and strengthened through this experience. Later that evening, Lady Lee stood at her office window overlooking the Pentagon's courtyard, watching military personnel representing every branch of American armed forces. Her European accent, once marked as foreign, now carried the authority of someone whose unconventional background had proven essential for defending American interests against enemies who understood conventional limitations better than America understood its own capabilities. The girl who had arrived in America as a teenager with dreams of serving her adopted country had become the woman who redefined what service could accomplish when preparation met opportunity. Her story proved that being underestimated could become America's secret weapon when someone refused to accept limitations that others imposed based on superficial judgments rather than actual capabilities. Outside, the sun set over Washington. As Lady Lee began preparing for tomorrow's challenges, knowing that the next crisis would find America defended by personnel whose capabilities were measured by competence rather than conformity to traditional expectations. She had proven that strength wasn't determined by size, that loyalty wasn't determined by background, and that leadership wasn't determined by fitting conventional profiles of what commanders should look like. Most importantly, she had demonstrated that sometimes the most valuable assets were hiding in plain sight, dismissed by people who confused familiarity with competence and tradition with effectiveness. Lady Lee smiled as she reviewed strategic planning documents, knowing that America's enemies would discover that underestimating her capabilities and the capabilities of others like her remained their most dangerous mistake. Up next, you've got 2 more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out. And don't forget to subscribe and turn on the notification bell so you don't miss any upload from us.